Hello, folks, and welcome to Author Adjacent, a podcast about the journey from hobbyist writer to professional author. I'm your host, Michael Vadney. If you're listening to this, you may not be ready to call yourself an author. Even I'm not there yet, but I am Author Adjacent. Before we dive into today's episode, a quick reminder. While I'm not a professional author, I have spent hundreds of hours researching writing topics and put hundreds of thousands of words to the page. As another writer on the path from hobbyist to professional, I started this podcast to share what has worked for me in the hopes that it will aid you in your own journey. Think of me as the wise old sage, shouting at you, "Take this wisdom, adventurer, for your quest ahead." Of course, you'll need to try things out and see what works for you. With that out of the way, let's jump into today's topic. For this episode of Author Adjacent, we're going to do things a little different. Normally, I pick a topic and condense my knowledge and experience into a well-packed and concise snack that you can consume at your leisure. But for today, I'll be going over 11 questions from the internet about writing. I've gathered these questions from Reddit's writing subreddit. Why 11? Mainly because I got bored looking for more. On to the questions! Our first question is brought to us by Mix Groundbreaking 603, titled Tips About Writing Fight Scene. They write, "It's my first one, and apparently I suck at it. Unfortunately, there are going to be more than a few over the course of this project, so I need to get better. Any tips you have to share?" Good question, Mix Groundbreaking 603, and I'm very surprised that I'm saying that name so quickly. First, if this is the first draft, I'd say don't worry about it. The details of the fight scene likely matter a lot less than you think it does, and you can make the scene more interesting in later drafts. So don't worry about it too much and just keep powering through your first draft. Second, get into and out of the scene as soon as possible. Otherwise, you risk losing readers by over-explaining the biomechanics of the movements that are happening between all the characters. Third, don't focus on the physical movements of the scene. Due to the medium of novel writing, fast-paced scenes are difficult to do with a lot of detail. As you add more detail to a particular moment, the reader's experience of it slows down, requiring them to read 3 paragraphs to grasp just 1 second of story time. So take advantage of a novel's strengths by expressing the fight scene through the character's emotions and physical sensations. Show the reader the panic, the fear, the exhilaration of a life-threatening situation, how their heart is pounding in their chest and their limbs are growing heavier with every swing, making survival less and less certain. Interestingly enough, all of this advice is also 100% applicable to sex scenes. So, extra bonus. Mix Groundbreaking 603, I hope that answers your question about fight scenes, and good luck with your story. Question 2 is titled, How Do I Know My Pacing Is Off? And is brought to us by Bonus Substantial 3224. They write, "Hey there. I'm writing a story, and after reaching page 10 in chapter 1 with a lot more to go, I'm wondering whether the story is engaging enough to be as long as it is and whether the pacing is too slow. Any advice would be appreciated." First, that is a great question. Pacing is something that a lot of people struggle with when they first start writing. Unfortunately, a sense for pacing is a feeling you build up over time with practice and exposure. But fortunately, there are multiple ways to check your pacing, but it all kind of just amounts to having the story read out loud. You can either ask someone to read your story aloud, because when the pacing is off, it becomes easier to notice through listening than it is through reading it on the page. Sometimes even when you can sense something is wrong with pacing in a story, it can be challenging to pinpoint where the issue starts and ends. Having the story read aloud can help you find that problem area. If you don't have someone to read it out for you, or you're afraid to ask someone to, you can insert your story into any kind of text-for-speech program. This option is not as good because machines don't read as well as a person, and they don't read naturally like a person, but it's likely to give you an idea of the pacing. Or you can, of course, read it out loud to yourself, but I don't really like this option for a few reasons. First, you're familiar with the pacing that you're aiming for and the intent of the page, so you're going to read it very differently than anyone else will. Second, it's difficult to pay attention to how things sound when you're also focusing on reading and speaking clearly and concisely. But that option is better than nothing if you can't do the first two. I will say, don't worry about pacing at first drafts, though. That draft is still you figuring out the story and telling yourself everything that happens. So it is fully and 100% expected for pacing to be absolutely abysmal. Just keep at it, keep pushing through, and then you will fix the pacing and all these other issues in draft 2. That's what that draft is for. All right, we are now on to question 3, titled How to Get Started with Writing, submitted by Nugget56456. They write, "Hi all. So I've had a basic idea for a story in my head that has evolved into a collection of characters and themes I absolutely love over the course of 7 or 8 years. I'm getting to the point where I really want to turn it into something tangible, and I'm hitting a few roadblocks. I'm not sure how to translate what is in my head into writing properly. I've never written anything beyond essays or short creative writing pieces before, and I guess I'm almost afraid I'll do my story and characters a disservice. I'm sure the answer is to just hop into it and not expect everything to be perfect immediately, but every time I try, I come up with a new direction I could take something in and start over again. How do you guys write your first story? I'm wondering if hearing from other people's struggles will help me, and if you're a veteran writer, do you have any tips for an inspiring creative writer?" First off, congratulations on joining the community and taking the leap. I know that it is very scary to admit to yourself that you want this in your life. The first thing I would suggest is building a writing habit. That will get you through so many slogs, and all stories eventually do become a slog, especially after you've gotten past that beginning part where the project is exciting and new. Like, a good writing habit will really carry you through the end. Second, I'd like to bring up the concept that the story on the page is very different from the story in your mind. While it's in your mind, it's this perfect, ephemeral, ever-changing thing. There are no pillars of stability because it doesn't exist. It's just a thought, an idea, probably one that you've been glorifying for a long time if you've been thinking about it over 7 or 8 years. Putting it on the page will help make you make decisions. It rises up these pillars of certainty so that you can look at it and go, yeah, I really like that. Or when you get something on the page that you thought was a great idea, you're like, no, I actually hate that. Accepting that the first pass of the story will likely be bad is a good idea, and it's okay that it's going to be bad. Everybody's first pass is bad. First drafts are just us figuring out what the story is about, telling ourselves the story so that we can refine it, make it better in later drafts, and give it to everyone else once we've fixed all those dirty problems. As for constantly changing the story, I suggest picking certain unchangeable facts and building around them. As you write your first draft, feel free to change anything else, but always move forward, so you can avoid the revision hell that tempts us all. When you do want to change something, just make a note in the appropriate place and keep writing the story as if the change is true. You'll fix it in the later draft. Again, congratulations on making the leap and starting your story. Keep going, keep powering through. You got this. On to question 4. F.J. Kruger writes, "Is it okay or even a good idea at all to use the same concept in more than one story?" Their post says, "After what feels like an eternity, I feel like I have a good grasp on my fantasy story, where I'm wanting to go. But now I'm also working on the concept for another fantasy story. The two stories are completely different, but share one main component. While the concept is the same, the way it's perceived and used is a complete 180 of each other. Consider a saving grace in one story, body horror in the other story. But I'm worried that using the same concept in more than one story may come off to people as repetitive or unoriginal. What are your opinions on something like this?" Well, my immediate question would be, how apparent is the similarities between the two stories from the reader's perspective? But based solely on the post, I'd say, F.J. Kruger, you're probably fine. There are many stories that essentially have the same concept at their core, but are presented and received in very different ways. Never Die by Robert J. Hayes and King of the Wild by Nicholas Ames. Both are bands of famous warriors that come together for a final adventure, but they're radically different stories in both their theme, what happens in them, the lessons that they have going on, and just the overall feel and crunch of the story. Your situation is a little different since those are two different authors for two different stories, but let's take Brandon Sanderson as an example, one of the most successful fantasy authors in the world right now. He has 3 books and book series: 1, Tests of the Emerald Sea, 2, Mistborn, and 3, the Skyward series, where in all 3 of them, a young woman who is given the opportunity to join a strange new world, sometimes literally, and through her exposure to that world gains power and learns more about themselves. It's all different varieties of the hero's journey. It's okay. All stories have technically been told already. We're just adding our own flair and our own combinations to how we want to tell our version of that story. I will say, just make sure your two stories are at least 20% different from one another. Like Romeo and Juliet compared to the Underworld movie franchise. Two households both alike in dignity compared to werewolves versus vampires. Question 5. How do I start my story? By Dino King Goji 73. Their post simply says, I'm finding it very difficult to find a way to start. If Dino King Goji 73 is asking at what point in the story they should start, I would suggest as close to the end as possible. This is a suggestion and a way of thinking brought by, I want to say, Kurt Vonnegut. I'm not sure if I'm saying his name right, but he has these 8 basic rules of creative writing. Check out the rest. It's all great advice. Maybe I'll do a future episode about it. But if the 73rd Goji King of the Dinos is just having difficulty starting the story, then there are a few things you can try. Write the scene that you are most excited about. While I like to write chronologically, and a lot of people do, it doesn't work for everyone. Sometimes you just need to start with the scenes that's really grabbing at you. The scene that you thought of when you decided to write this story. Maybe it's the climax, maybe it's just this one little nugget that really shows how a character is presented in your story. Write those ones to build the momentum, and then you can go back and jump around and fill in the gaps in between. Sometimes it's easier to write the end of your story and work your way backwards. I actually find outlining this way to be a lot easier. It informs me where the story should begin by knowing where it needs to end. Unfortunately, though, getting started boils down to sitting down at your desk, computer, or typewriter and making or tricking yourself into doing it. But you got this. I believe in the Dino King of Goji 73. Question number 6. How to write characters with jobs you're not familiar with. This question was posted by Neither Industry 712, and they write, I'm working on this book with a character who is in law school. It's not going to be a big chunk of the story, but for a background sake, I want to explore what could have been his experience. But I don't know anything about law students' day or how does their life look, like what do they do for fun? What could he complain about in school? What inside jokes do law students know? Do you also experience this problem? If yes, how do you do it? Well, I would say this very much depends on how much law student jargon you want in your story. If you want to keep it light, then you might be able to get away with taking some notes while doing some online research or watching a few movies with law students. Find an example that you want to emulate is always a safe bet. Just don't rip it directly from the source. Like I keep saying, just change it 20%. But if the main character being a law student is important and features prominently in your plot, then more research is going to be involved. If that is the case, try interviewing some law students over lunch or coffee. Most people won't say no to a free meal or a drink. I don't, at least. All of this advice applies to any area of knowledge that we lack as writers. Portraying any collection of people, whether grouped by occupation, culture, or ethnicity, can get problematic if done lazily, so make sure you put in the time and effort required to really know what you're talking about. Good luck with your book, Neither Industry 712. On to question number 7. Question about editing while writing first draft. This one was submitted by Run4Fun4 and goes on to say, I'm very early in writing of my first novel, and I've heard lots of advice about not editing until you finish the first draft. My question is about a chapter I'm currently writing. I've written it to the end, but realize I want to change a few things. I wrote myself a note to remind myself of what I want to change at the appropriate spot and was planning to just move on to the next chapter. But now I'm thinking I should just make the changes now and be done with it. It involves a slight change of setting and developing relationships between characters. They don't change the events of the story, though. What do you, more seasoned writers, do in these situations? Well, I'm an author-adjacent writer, just like Run4Fun4, but since the question was blasted to the internet, I'm going to answer it anyways. I'm a big advocate of not editing during the first draft. I've spoken on this a little bit in previous episodes, but it's an inefficient use of your time to edit something that you may end up cutting entirely in subsequential drafts. Writing a novel takes a lot of time, sometimes years. Just ask George R. R. Martin. So you're best served by doing what you can to make good use of your very limited writing time. Plus, you learn so much about the story and what it needs simply by finishing the first draft. I'm in revisions currently, and as I work on draft 2, I'm looking to change 50 to 60% of draft 1's story. All that being said, every writer should do what they must to finish the story. Every writer's journey is different, as is the toolset that they take on that journey. The change was obviously bothering Run 4 Fun 4 enough to make a Reddit post about it, so they might as well go back and change it and make this small change. Run 4 Fun 4, you have my blessing to go back and fix this one thing. Though, I'm just a guy on the internet, you don't really need my blessing. On to question number 8. How do I write a fictional story in a fictional world without overloading my readers with exposition? This Reddit post was submitted by BSamePut0. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but that's what it looks like to me on the text. But their post goes on to say, I'm trying to write a sci-fi fantasy novel series that requires a lot of world building, but I'm trained as in journalism and like matter-of-fact simple writing. If resources were unlimited, I'd just write a screenplay, but novels are the lowest barrier of entry to writing a story while maintaining complete creative control, in my opinion. The problem is I can't stand flowery language or prose. I don't want to pause to explain every word, and I don't want to load up on exposition in big bodies of text. So I've been playing with the idea of creating a glossary and giving people the option to look it up if they can't use context clues to figure out what I'm trying to communicate. What do y'all think about that? I'd say that this is a very common issue for writers who write second world fiction, which is any fiction, usually fantasy or sci-fi, that takes place in a world radically different from our own. The glossary idea is a good idea to include, but for the most part, readers don't like to pause in their reading, flip all the way to the back or the front of the book, look up the word, and then flip back and keep doing that back and forth. It's not an enjoyable process for most people, and it will turn a lot of people off, unfortunately. The glossary is still a good idea to throw in there. I really like seeing them in fantasy books, but I like seeing them after I have finished the book. When I can look at those definitions and those explanations with all the knowledge of the book, I usually learn something that I didn't really pick up on the magic system or some characters or a place's name just by reading that glossary afterwards. It's honestly one of my favorite things. I think more people should include glossaries. But the glossary is not a stand-in for explaining how your world works or your technology or your magic system. You are unfortunately burdened with that yourself. Learning how to do this without info dumping on your reader is a challenge, especially for new writers. Readers have more patience with an established author because they have a proven track record of delivering the goods on an enjoyable story. I'm going to bring up Brandon Sanderson again because he famously has a steep learning curve for his novels that require a lot of reader buy-in. He earned that buy-in through his first novels, Elantris and the Mistborn trilogy, the first 3. If you can tell, I'm a bit of a Sanderson fan. He isn't the best author, but you can't argue with success like he has. But back to the task. Ask yourself, what is the point of your world building? Is it required for the story you are telling? If it's not, consider not having it at all, especially if your aim is to go for a more minimalist writing style. Everything in your novel should be aimed towards telling the best version of your story. If your novel is about dragon riders who defend cities from waves of aliens, then it probably doesn't matter to the world building, the tools and techniques used by the mountainous farming communities. Essentially what I'm saying is, cut the fat. What's left of your world building will be more wieldy and easier to implement in a novel without info dumping. Unfortunately, you have picked a genre that usually requires the most in-world explanation of things that are going on. A cheap way to do this is usually to have a character who is not familiar with the world or that section of the world, so that you have an excuse to tell the reader, thereby that character, what is going on exactly. Question number 9. Hazul Hay writes, "What's wrong with using passive voice?" I come across a lot of writing advice that suggests one should avoid the passive voice, but I'm never really entirely sure why. I'm going to start answering this question by saying passive voice isn't inherently wrong, but it can make the writing less engaging for the reader. It can obscure which character is performing an action, which can confuse a reader, and passive voice often requires more words than an active voice would, making it less efficient use of your page space. It also creates distance between the reader and what is happening in the book, like filler words. You want the reader to feel the scene as strongly or even more so than the characters do. That's how you keep the readers engaged. Passive voice essentially reduces how readable your story is. But that's not to say passive voice is 100% wrong in all cases, like when the action is performed by a character that is either unknown or irrelevant to the reader. Like most rules of writing, it's best to follow it as much as you can, but it's okay to break it on occasion. Question number 10. Chapter length by Own Election 5124. They write, "Hi, so I just started working on my first novel. It's a fantasy novel revolving around a city and a gang of rebels, but in all my time writing, I've been a bit scared of one thing, the length of my chapters. I've written about 10,000 words in my first act, but my chapters only last at a maximum 4 pages, and I can't combine the chapters since each chapter switches POV. Should I be worried? I know this is a first draft, but can this genuinely cause a problem later on?" Right off the bat, I'd say there's nothing to worry about. It's a first draft. Up to 100% of this story might change by the time draft 2 starts. That being said, I do have some information that might be helpful for more people like Own Election 5124. Chapters can be as long or as short as you need them to be. My favorite example of this is from a story that I unfortunately cannot remember the name or even much about the story, but what I do recall is it is an adventure, and there are tons of things happening, and about 3/4 of the way through the book, they meet up with somebody from their past, and the person from their past asks them, like, what happened? What's been going on? And the next chapter is just a single line. He told her the story. End of chapter. That's it. Just a few words, and we know everything that happened. He, the main character that we've been following this whole time, told her the story, the person that came from the past, and just explained everything. It was awesome. And it was very short. I'd also want to note that chapters can have multiple POVs, but when you do switch POV in those chapters, it's important to make it very clear to the reader that the POV has changed. Usually you'll see this in the form of 3 little asterisks centered on the page, and then the first sentence of the new POV is, "This character sees this," or "This character does that." And that way the reader knows absolutely, like, oh, okay, this is a POV change. We were in Derek's, and now we're in Alice's. But don't worry about it too much at this stage, and congratulations on getting to 10,000 words of your first act. That's spectacular. All right, and on to our final question, question 11. Should you use your best ideas when you're starting out, or save them up until you're better at writing? By Automatic Let 9167. They post, "I have a lot of ideas for plot lines, character voices, plot twists, settings, jokes, etc. that I'm convinced are the best ideas ever, but I'm super inexperienced with writing, so I'm concerned that I might use up all of my favorite ideas in my earliest, most amateur stories, and then they'll be wasted on my lack of writing ability. Any advice? Should I just use up all of my best ideas now and assume that I'll come up with better ideas in the future anyway?" All right, folks, real talk on this one, and I want to be very clear. Ideas are not precious. I'm going to be paraphrasing a story here, but there's this tale of Jim Butcher, the author of the Dresden Files, arguing in an online forum years ago about which is more important, story ideas or author skill. Jim said that it was the author, while some internet rando said it was the ideas. The argument got heated, and eventually Jim made a bet with this internet random that they would write any fantasy story book idea and do it well. So the rando provided what he thought would be a difficult, if not impossible idea. A cross between Pokemon and the Roman Legion. The Codex Alura by Jim Butcher is now a 6-book series that has sold thousands, if not millions of copies. It's a pretty good series, and I would actually highly suggest checking it out if you're into fantasy. I was very impressed by it, and I didn't even know this story about its origin until afterwards, and only in retrospect made the Pokemon Roman Legion connection. I was like, wow, that was done really well. But what that story tells us is we as authors and author-adjacent writers need to get better at our skills. We need to put in the reps, we need to put the words on the page and develop ourselves as writers. The ideas, we will be able to make new ideas anytime. The ideas is something that we will start with and turn into something that other people want to read. But they're an unlimited supply and they will come from all over the place. So use your best ideas now. Put your best foot forward in every single story that you write. Try not to save them. But I will say there is something to be said about waiting to write a story you're not ready for. I have a fantasy time-traveling book that I keep in my back pocket that I want to get to someday. But for now, I feel it's too complex of a story for my current skill set. So I understand where you're coming from. It's something that you should stretch. You should try to write that more difficult story. And you just need to be honest with yourself about where your skill set is and what is the skill set required to tell this story. Because you are more likely going to be able to accomplish way more than you think you can. You got this. Push yourself to do it. As I'm working through my current novel, I started thinking about what the second one would be now that I'm completed with the first draft and I'm working through revisions right now. And I started thinking about the idea like, all right, is it going to be time to write that fantasy time traveling book you've always wanted to do? And eventually I just came to the conclusion of, I just need to do it. I just need to try. And I kind of regret a little bit not writing it the first time because I think I could have stretched my skills and figured it out. Because so much of writing a book is just putting in the work and figuring the story out as you go, and then refining it into this like beautiful diamond. So there is value in writing a book you're not ready for and trying to rise to the occasion, because either you figure out how to do it well and it all works out, or it comes out poorly and you learn from the process anyways. In either case, you're better off than where you started. All right, folks, that's going to wrap it up for this episode of Author Adjacent. Thank you for hanging out with me today as I rambled my answers to internet questions. Once again, I am Michael Vadney. If any of this was helpful or even just gave you a good chuckle, consider supporting the show by leaving a review on your podcast platform of choice or telling a friend about the show. For more Author Adjacent, you can follow me on X at Author Adjacent or shoot me an email at authoradjacent@gmail.com with all your burning questions, comments, or topic ideas. New episodes drop every other week, so stay tuned. Now remember, the journey from writer to author might be long, but until then, let's be author adjacent together.